Trump needs backup, Massey wants to debate process. When the movement needs unity, especially at the biggest moments, Massey's willing to vote with Democrats. When conservatives are fighting the most radical left in American history, too often Massey's instinct is to throw elbows at fellow Republicans instead of the people who are destroying our country or want to destroy our country. And there's one man standing in their way, and it's President Trump.
It's really incredible, isn't it, Willie? You have a Secretary of Defense who is fighting a war that has upended the economy, not only in America, but across the world. That as Bob Kagan has written, may be one of the greatest losses militarily in American history. And he finds time to campaign against a Republican congressman who Donald Trump hates, because that Republican congressman is trying to follow through on Donald Trump and Republican candidates' promise to release all the Epstein files. And because Donald Trump has been trying in every way possible to cover up the Epstein files, something we haven't talked about since this war began, he is doing everything he can, along with all of his billionaire supporters, to destroy a congressman who wants the Epstein files released. And the Secretary of Defense has time to go down, and instead of trying to prosecute this war, which we are losing politically, he's instead trying to beat a congressman because the congressman wants full accountability for the victims of Epstein and all the very powerful people around Epstein. Some say, including the president.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary, unusual, inappropriate for a defense secretary to be on the campaign trail to begin with. Let's just start there, to be out campaigning for a candidate. There are Hatch Act considerations potentially here. But then to do it in the middle of a war where just hours ago the president was on the brink, he said, of a new round of strikes against Iran before pulling back again. We'll get into that in just a moment. You have the Secretary of Defense on the campaign trail. And as you say, why are they fighting against Thomas Massey? Because he wants all the information out. He wants the truth out about the Epstein files. And this is how hard they're working to suppress that truth. The president dispatching his Secretary of Defense to campaign against the guy who's trying to get to the bottom of that. Also, Joe, I know this is something you've talked about for years now, which is that Thomas Massey, the argument goes from his opponents and yesterday from the head of defense, is not conservative, that he's anti-Trump, he's not conservative. Look at the voting record of Thomas Massey. Talk to anybody who's ever spent 10 minutes on Capitol Hill. He is incredibly conservative in all the ways that conservatism used to actually hold up. Now we're talking about Trumpism, which is something very different from conservatism. But the MAGA folks, Secretary of Defense, trying to conflate those two things. If you're against Donald Trump, even on the Epstein files, now you're not conservative.
Yeah, I mean, you look. Let's just go down the list really quickly, because Republicans are waking up this morning and they are down. Well, it's really historic numbers, over 10 percentage points in the generic ballot tests, and that's not just the New York Times Siena poll, which actually usually trends more Trump than other polls. It certainly did during the campaign. But you look at a lot of other polls, Atlas, an A-plus poll, double-digit losses for Republicans on the generic ballot test. Really, it goes back to what I said when I was in Congress and pushing to balance a budget. I said, if you give voters a chance to vote for a real Democrat or a Republican trying to be a Democrat, they're going to vote for the real Democrat every time. You look at this generic ballot, keep that up. Let me explain something to you. When people like Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump go around talking about conservative, I've said it for 10 years. There is nothing conservative about Donald Trump. And now that the Republican Party has kowtowed to him like he kowtows to Xi and kowtows to Putin, this is what you get. You get a Republican Party that has exploded the deficit in historic ways And the debt, Willie, has skyrocketed. Donald Trump promised to balance the budget. He promised to pay off the debt. Donald Trump, no matter when he leaves office, will set the record for actually piling on the greatest debt ever. In fact, he will have piled on more debt over his time in office than every other American president combined. It is absolutely staggering. The national debt is going to go up probably to $50 trillion over the next year. We're already over 100% of GDP. Donald Trump now has America spending more servicing its debt than on our national defense. You want to talk about the Epstein files? They promised full accountability. What do we get? We get no accountability, and now Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth want to try to defeat the Republican that wants full accountability for those that were predators against Epstein's victims. You could talk about Russia. Donald Trump is doing everything he can to destroy a NATO alliance that crushed the Soviet Union. My father was a Cold Warrior. That's why our family became Republicans. It was to push back against Russian aggression. You have Donald Trump and Republicans allowing and Pete Hegseth doing everything he can do to help Putin win, to undermine Ukraine, to undermine Poland by pulling out troops, to undermine Germany by pulling out troops, to undermine NATO day in and day out, and Ukraine. And so the Republicans are actually taking the side that radical leftists used to take in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and they wonder why they're losing. The same thing with President Xi. You have Donald Trump going over there, and what's happening? They're abandoning Taiwan. Again, going along with a communist Chinese leader and saying, well, I don't know whether we're going to fund Taiwan anymore. No president does that. And Willie, I could go down the list time and time again. You have Donald Trump and his Republican Party doing the exact opposite of what conservatives did. For 50 years, for 60 years, we balanced the budget 4 years in a row. We pushed back against Russian aggression. We pushed back against the communist Chinese. We did everything we could to empower NATO to push back against Russian aggression, to expand NATO. They're doing just the opposite, and they wonder why they're getting crushed right now. They don't care about affordability. They don't care about working Americans. They only care about doing what Donald Trump tells them to do, and we see the result. It's very, very bad. So Thomas Massie, not conservative, please. Pete Hegseth, not conservative. Again, really quickly, this is a guy who 10 years ago was campaigning against Donald Trump, said he cared more about himself than military people, and stood before a group of military men and women. And what did he say? If Donald Trump's president, don't follow illegal orders. It's on tape. And now what's he doing? He's trying to go after a war hero, again, something that Republicans would never do in the past, trying to go after a war hero, highly decorated war hero who's also a U.S. senator, because he's saying the same thing Pete Hegseth said before he started blindly chasing power. It's a sad display, and American voters are onto it.
Yeah, and Jonathan Lemire, to Joe's point about affordability, there seems to be absolutely no focus from the White House, despite everything we're seeing at gas pumps and food stores and groceries and everywhere else. It's anything but the core issue that's dragging down the poll numbers, as Joe just showed, and we'll dig into some more. They just keep getting worse for this president because of the issue of inflation, which is tied to the war in Iran, which most Americans in these polls don't support. They don't see, haven't been explained well, the point of this war, why we remain over there. So what does the White House plan to do, if anything, at this point to change the trajectory of what we're seeing in those polls before November?
So after Republicans took some losses in the elections last fall, the White House, told reporters President Trump's going to start traveling every week, domestic trip every week, and every week he's going to talk about the economy, what's working, and he's going to acknowledge that affordability is an issue, and we're going to come up with a series of solutions to address that. By my count, I think he's gone twice since December. No domestic travel, and that's in part because of adjustments to his schedule, in part perhaps because of his age. but also, of course, he's been consumed with the war and other things. And he has shown no ability, even from his perch at the White House, no ability to show any empathy to Americans. Hey, I understand things are tough right now. Yes, we have to sacrifice a bit because of this war. None of that. Last week, he's on the White House lawn saying he doesn't care about Americans' financial situations. He literally just said that. And that is what Republicans have been so nervous about. So they are deeply concerned about November, and President Trump isn't helping at all. And instead, he's consumed with legacy projects like the Ballroom and Arch, the war, and going after his political foes. Now, that sometimes means the Department of Justice, or in this case, it means trying to defeat a Republican who has defied him, Congressman Massey. Now, Trump has shown just in the last 10 days or so, he still has a hold on the GOP. Those who oppose him in Indiana, lost. Senator Cassidy over the weekend, lost. And now it's Massey's turn, and Trump has mobilized even his defense secretary at a time of war to go after Massey. And for good measure, Lauren Boebert, another Republican congresswoman, another Trump loyalist for a time, who also defied him on the Epstein files. She went to Kentucky, Joe, to campaign for Massey, and now Trump is targeting her and saying someone should primary Lauren Boebert. Of course, we should note the Colorado filing deadline was months ago, so that's not going to happen. Yeah. But again, it shows you what Trump is thinking about, what he actually cares about.
And the media is breathlessly reporting on these, Bill Cassidy losing. Okay, well, Democrats should rejoice that you have somebody actually that can win statewide, and instead putting in somebody that's going to kowtow to Donald Trump no matter what he does, who puts that state in play finally. And Willie, it's really great news for Republicans that Donald Trump's going around knocking off Republicans that can win even in these deeply red districts. And I will tell you, more and more people are in the Republican Party are concerned about the redistricting. When you look at the poll numbers, you see that Donald Trump's doing historically bad with Hispanics, doing historically bad with younger voters, doing historically bad with independents and Republicans as well. So all of these machinations that are going on that right now the White House is cheering actually will work against them most likely in the fall. I've got to say one other thing. The White House wanted Donald Trump to go out and talk about affordability, but when he goes out the two times and talks about affordability, he calls it, in his words, bullshit. Something made up by the Democrats. You look at the polls, Willie, it is anything but that.
Yeah, and that crosses parties and certainly is hitting with independents, as we'll look at those numbers in just a moment. Meanwhile, President Trump has announced he once again will postpone a planned U.S. military strike on Iran, this time issuing both the threat and the pullback in a single lengthy Truth Social post. The president wrote yesterday an attack had been scheduled for today, but that he would be holding off, citing requests from Gulf allies and what he says are serious negotiations now taking place. The president added, however, he instructed military leadership to be, quote, prepared to go forward with a full, large-scale assault of Iran on a moment's notice if a deal is not reached. He also noted any deal would include, quote, no nuclear weapons for Iran. Over the past few weeks, the president repeatedly has issued threats and set deadlines for Tehran before ultimately backing off. Pattern that's played out at least 6 times since late March. As for that polling we've been discussing, President Trump's approval rating sinking amid the unpopular war with Iran. The latest New York Times Siena poll shows nearly 2/3 of Americans think going to war was the wrong decision, including almost 3/4 of independent voters. Amid rising gas and energy prices, a majority, 55%, said the war is not worth the costs. Only 33% approve of how the president has handled the economy as a whole, 64% disapproving. When it comes to affordability, 69% of Americans disapprove of how President Trump has handled the cost of living. Among Hispanic voters, Joe just mentioned this, Trump's approval has fallen to 20%. That is the lowest number from that voting bloc in the history of New York Times Siena polling for a president. And among the critical independent voters, just 1 in 4, 26% of those voters approve of the president's job performance. All of this spelling trouble for Republicans ahead of the midterms, as the poll shows Democrats with that double-digit lead over the Republican Party on a hypothetical 2026 midterm ballot. Joe.
I've been following polls my adult life. I've never seen generic ballots this bad for either party. Let's bring in right now Politics Bureau Chief, Senior columnist at Politico, Jonathan Martin, also Associate columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post, David Ignatius. J. Mart, let's go to you first on those polls. Again, I'm sure, like me, you've never seen a generic ballot test this bad for the Republican Party, and it keeps going down. But there are a couple of other numbers that really pop out to me that should scare the hell out of Republicans in Florida, in Texas, in California, in states where there's a lot of redistricting, and that's Hispanics. I mean, I will tell you, you couldn't talk to a Republican operative in just 18 months ago that said the tide has changed forever in American politics. So the Hispanics are breaking wildly towards the Republicans, and they were. And Democrats were saying the same thing. Something has changed. It will forever change the future of politics. Well, as you and I know, the future of politics usually lasts about 6 months. Now, Hispanics, that's about as low a number as I've ever. Mitt Romney was eviscerated for getting 28% of the Hispanic vote. There was a huge postmortem. What do we do? What do we do? Right. Donald Trump is 8 points below Mitt Romney. And same thing with young voters. Young voters were breaking at, I thought, astonishing numbers towards Donald Trump and the Republican Party. The same thing has happened with young voters. A radical break away from Donald Trump from Republicans, and we're just seeing numbers that appear to be historic, certainly in the congressional balloting.
Joe, you and I have lived through about 3 40-year realignments in the last 20 years. So it's kind of like the old joke about the guy who predicted, 5 of the last 0 recessions. It's the numbers are about as brutal as you could possibly imagine at this point in an election cycle. Midterms are always tough for the party in power. I don't know if I've ever seen a midterm that was shaping up to be this bad this early, expressly because of the choices of the president. This is on his hands. He made the choice to pursue an elective war in the Middle East that he was told could increase the prices of global oil, and he did it, and this is the response. Give him credit, Joe, because in 24, Trump did put together a coalition that made profound inroads, deep inroads with non-white working class voters, Black, Asian, Hispanic, that if they had been sustained would have broken the back of the Democratic coalition, especially when paired with Reagan-style inroads with younger voters that you just mentioned. The problem is he's done nothing to nurture that coalition because he was never interested in sustaining a coalition, Joe, because it's not a larger ideological project. It's not a movement. It's a personality project. Trump is for Trump. He's not creating Trumpism. And I think that gets to the heart of the matter here. He just wants to get big victories for Trump instead of trying to find a way to sustain and grow the coalition that he won in 2024. You and I know what happened in 24. He was running against a deeply unpopular president who pulled out there in the summer, handed the baton to a flawed VP. And I think that goes to the heart of what happened in 24 more than what he did. But still, he put together the coalition he did. And the day after the election has done virtually nothing to sustain the coalition. And the one issue he had that he did live on for a while was immigration. And then because he decided to hand his immigration policy to Stephen Miller, he lost that issue, the advantage on that issue, in the streets of Minneapolis in January.
Well, I was going to say, Willie, not only did he do nothing to sustain the possibility of historic Hispanic growth as far as support for the Republican Party, his policies were seen as actively going to war against Hispanics in America, and the horrors that not only they have gone through and Americans being gunned down in the streets, city streets of America. Not only do we have that, but we now have internment camps, and the horror stories that are coming out of internment camps that the Trump administration does not want you to hear about. That's being heard by family members, loved ones, friends of the people that are inside those internment camps, being brutalized, being treated horribly, and there's been a veil of darkness over those internment camps. Congress is not being allowed to go in. The media is not being allowed to go in. It's like nothing I've ever seen in my life in America. That the people that are funding these internment camps through appropriations aren't allowed to go inside the internment camps to see the humanitarian violations that are going on But guess what? Word is coming out. It is spreading through communities, and you see historically low support among Hispanics. This is one of the reasons why, one of the big reasons why.
Yeah, it's no mystery why the administration doesn't want eyes on what's going on inside of those detention centers. And as we've talked about quite a bit, the deal many Trump voters made in 2024, including many Latino voters, was, yes, get the violent criminals out of the country. We agree with that, too. Get them out of our neighborhoods. But what they're seeing instead is people they know, neighbors, hardworking people, being dragged from their homes, put into detention centers, being dragged from their homes and being deported. That is not the deal that voters made. And many Latino voters now have turned, as you say, it's only been 18 months, completely flipped, in fact, gone below where they were before that election in terms of support for President Trump. So, David Ignatius, as we get back to the war in Iran, which has sparked all these increased prices across the country, especially in gas, let's talk about what Donald Trump, the president, did yesterday with that True Social post saying, I was just about to annihilate Iran. He's done this 6 or 7 times now, where he was just about to launch a full-scale military assault, but slammed on the brakes to give more time for negotiations with Gulf states and Iran. He says there are now serious negotiations. There are positive developments. He often says these things. We don't have any evidence that any of those things are actually taking place. What is your sense of those conversations toward a peace deal right now?
So, Willie, the first feeling I have is a sense of the president's desperation. He faces a terrible set of choices, this erratic pattern of extreme threat against Iran, followed by delay, has been characteristic now for several months. He does have advisors who are urging him to go back into full-scale war and finish the job, as people would say in quotation marks, get it done, reopen the Strait of Hormuz by force. He knows what a messy campaign that would be, how long it would last, how little decisive result it might produce. So he's looking for an alternative diplomatic approach that he can do, in effect, under the cover of regional powers. And that's the way I see yesterday's announcement. He's saying that the 3 leading figures in the Middle East, the leaders of Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, have decided to seek a negotiated settlement with Iran that might serve everybody's interests. If they can find that, they have all sorts of contacts, long-standing people that they've worked with in Iran. If they can find that pathway, then Trump can declare a victory. It will be not far from perfect resolution, but at least get it off the table for the short term. Do I have confidence that that's possible? To be honest, Trump was near that sort of deal with the pragmatic speaker of the Iranian parliament more than a month ago, and it blew up because hardliners in Tehran are in control. I have no evidence that that's not still the case, but it's obvious that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are trying to find that pathway to get some sort of arrangement that would reopen the strait. I can imagine some sort of international mechanism that pays people some money that Trump thinks he can stomach. Basically, what we're watching is the consequences of this absolutely acute problem. How do you reopen the strait without going back to full-scale war?
And of course, those Gulf states you just mentioned, those have been the target of retaliation from Iran in the war that the United States began. Everyone sit tight. We're going to continue this conversation after a quick break. More with David Ignatius, Jonathan Martin, new reporting from Jonathan Lemire out of the White House. Plus, Vladimir Putin now arrives in Beijing for his summit with Xi Jinping. Morning Joe's coming right back. People were killed in the shooting at the Islamic Center in San Diego yesterday. The center's imam said the victims include a security guard and 2 staff members from the Islamic school. All the children at the school are safe. The attack comes amid rising reports of Islamophobia in the United States. The Council on American Islamic Relations says it received more than 8,600 civil rights complaints just last year. That's the most the group has recorded in nearly 3 decades, writing in its 2025 report, quote, government actions and official rhetoric treated Muslims and people who speak up for Palestinian human rights as suspicious and outside the circle of protected religious and civic life, end quote. Let's bring in MS NOW reporter Jillian Frankel. She joins us live from San Diego, outside the home of one of the suspected shooters. Jillian, good morning. What else are we learning today about this attack?
Hey guys, good morning. Yeah, that's right. We're outside the neighborhood where we believe one of the suspects may have lived. There's been a law enforcement presence here steadily since yesterday, and obviously so many unanswered questions still remain this morning. But here's what we do know. A call came into law enforcement around 9:42 a.m. yesterday about a runaway juvenile whose mother was concerned that her teenage son may have been suicidal. She said that several of her weapons were missing and her vehicle was missing, and that her son had departed with a companion who was wearing camo. Law enforcement was dispatched locally, and within a couple of hours, around 11:42, 11:43 a.m. yesterday, the call came in about that shooting at the Islamic Center of San Diego. 3 adults, as you mentioned, found dead there, including the center's security guard and 2 staffers. Law enforcement said that the suspects then shot at a landscaper just a few blocks away from there, and then shortly after were found deceased in their vehicle from self-inflicted gunshot wounds. Now, our own Mark Santia is able to report that anti-Islamic writings were actually found inside the vehicle. In addition to law enforcement pressers yesterday, we also heard from the imam of that Islamic center who said that this is a place of worship, not a battlefield. I want you to hear from him directly. Here's more.
The other mosques and all the places of worship in our beautiful city should always be protected. It is extremely outrageous to target a place of worship.
And this is still actively being investigated as a hate crime. Law enforcement is continuing to collect evidence from these scenes here. Willie?
MS Now reporter Jillian Frankel live in San Diego for us. Jillian, thanks so much. Joe, some reporting this morning, too, that security guard who was killed outside the school stood between the shooters and the children inside and being called a hero this morning, rightly so.
Yeah, incredible eyewitness seeing him actually take a shot and then run inside to protect those inside. An absolute hero. And David Ignatius, just an absolute tragedy right now. You have historic levels of anti-Muslim hatred across America, a rising tide of anti-Semitism across America. The events of October 7th and Gaza and everything that's followed has led to a complete lack of dialogue in some of the places where it's needed the most badly, on college campuses, among our young people. The hatred that is spreading online against Muslims, against Jews, against Hispanics, against Asians, against, quote, the others, is sad and unfortunate. I can tell you, as someone evangelical, someone who was raised in the church, I do understand that there is a place for people of faith in government, but seeing this constant un-American campaign by people posting on official U.S. government websites that we are a Christian nation and quoting Bible verses on historic sites, that it goes completely against what the First Amendment says. And you also, at the same time, have a lot of those people also saying terrible things about Muslims, saying terrible things about, quote, the others, and unfortunately, anti-Semitic slurs, anti-Muslim slurs continue to skyrocket, and people lose their lives as well.
So we're just tearing each other up in this country. I think we all feel it. There's something oppressive about it. And we're a country that just desperately needs good leaders. We look to the administration, Donald Trump, and often what we see is more polarization, more inflammatory rhetoric. When you hear a story about a person like this security guard, just a guy standing in front of the building who has the courage to try to save people because that's his job and because that's what keeps our country and the place he was assigned orderly. You think, okay, that's the spirit that gets us out of this. That multiplied by 1 million, by 100 million, that produces the country that we love and want to live in. And I never want to give up hope on that. But this is a time when we're really under strain, and the institutions that should be helping us, like the Supreme Court, seem oblivious to some of these pressures. A shooting almost every day somewhere. And we sail along with this extreme view of the Second Amendment. Sometimes it's just a depressing picture. But when you hear those stories of the individual heroes, you think, yeah, bang, that's still it.
Yeah, and again, you're so right. I mean, the growing tide of gun violence and nothing happening post Sandy Hook. We thought there would be a reckoning. Just basic. Things that 90% of Americans support, like universal background checks. Republicans keep blocking that.
শেষে